Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. Today I'm joined by Dr. Alex Malpass. We're going to be discussing paradoxes of infinity, and in particular, the Grim Reaper or Grim Messenger or Benedetti paradox, variously called. And also, if we have time, near the end, we're going to get to perhaps actual infinities and successive addition. But I'm not sure whether or not we'll have time. We'll see. I guess we could just start off with what is the Grim Reaper or Grim Messenger paradox? And yeah, can you just take us through that, Alex?
Yeah, okay. So the way I think about it is that it's a paradox which I associate with Jose Benedetti, because he kind of first came up with this pattern of reasoning, although probably sustained historical research would figure out that he didn't come up with it first. I'd be very surprised if this wasn't something that had been noticed by previous people. It's probably some Stoic or someone who had reasoned in a similar way, right? But the way that and Benedetti's got like tons and tons of different versions of the paradox. So it's best not to. I think that one of the key things is it's best not to sort of fixate on the details, but to pull away to the kind of abstract logical form of it. But I won't cut straight to that. There's an example, a typical example from Benedetti's book is considering a man trying to walk across a distance from A to B, and as he's doing so, there's a god, as Benedetti says, a god, like lowercase g, who's waiting halfway, like hiding behind a bush or something, watching him coming, and he's got the intention to create ex nihilo an impassable wall that will arrest his journey, were to make it halfway. So obviously the guy's not going to finish that journey, because if he was to make it halfway, then this god is going to prevent him from getting there. And unbeknownst to that god, there's another one who's waiting halfway between him and the start point, and he's got exactly the same intention too. And again, unbeknownst to him, there's another god who's exactly halfway between him and that guy, and so on ad infinitum, right? There's just a never-ending sequence of these guys ever closer to the starting point of this person's journey. And the weird thing about this is that you can convince yourself that not only is the guy not going to get to the end of the walkway, right? He's actually not going to take any. He's not going to even make a single step, not a nanometer step forwards, because think about it. If he were to get any distance across, then for any distance he's about to get to, there'll have already been a god there, which would have prevented him from getting that distance. But the really sort of weird thing about this is that none of the gods are going to actually deploy their wall, because for any god, there's going to have been one that would have got there first, meaning that god definitely isn't going to deploy his wall. So you can convince yourself of both things if you think about it, that the guy's not going to move a single step, but also there's no wall that's even going to be prevented. There's no wall that's even going to be created that would prevent him. There just literally is nothing in front of him that's stopping him moving forwards. But it seems like he can't take any single step forwards either. And that he can walk forwards, he can't walk forwards, is one way of thinking about this paradoxically, right? There's this seemingly the situation pulls in two different directions at the same time. And other versions of this is, you can imagine a kind of infinitely deafening peal, which gongs and would deafen you were you to hear it at that point. But half a minute before that's about to sound, there's another one which would deafen you if you were to hear that one. And 15 seconds before that, there's another one. 7.5 seconds before that, there's another one. Blah blah blah. You're going to get deafened, but there's no gong that's going to deafen you, or a whole load of guys, like mob guys, shooting you with bullets, and each of them, you can think of the time at which the bullet is fired into you as it's kind of like ascending towards a cutoff point. So what we've got is, in each of these cases, it's exploiting a common structure, which is to have a kind of never-ending sequence. That's primarily the aspect of this that draws most of its attention, especially when we come to see how this is used by people defending versions of the Kalam argument these days. is that they're really highlighting the idea that you just can't have setups where you've got this kind of never-ending sequence. So it's another thing that draws attention to kind of infinity, or like infinitely divisible if they're all packed into one finite area, or it might be that you've got them spread out at regular intervals over an infinitely long distance or something. But the key is that you just it's the kind of beginninglessness, the fact that there's no first actor in these sequences that prevents it from having a resolution. Because I mean, if you take the story and change it slightly, and just suppose that there is like a first god on this pathway, then what you find is that the guy tries to take a step forwards, he makes a wall, and that stops the guy, and that's it. There's nothing paradoxical about that. It's only paradoxical if for each guy there's a previous one who's going to make the wall first, right? That's where you get into this issue. So it seems like you can resolve this by just sort of asserting that there must be a finite number of steps in any such sequence, that it has a kind of end point or something. Hopefully that set up a kind of general structure.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I also wanted to draw listeners' attention to the fact that, like you said, there are so many different versions of this, not only with like the mechanisms by which you're kind of generating the paradox, right? You've like the deafening gongs, the deafening peals. You have the grim messengers, right, where they're writing their number on a paper if and only if no earlier or no previous member writes their number on the paper. You have the grim reapers, where there's an infinite sequence of grim reapers that are going to kill someone. You've got the mob. So a lot of these different variants of it. But you also have different variants in terms of, I guess, how the infinite array of mechanisms, right, how that's kind of structured in space and time, right? So you could have a supertask version of it, which is just performing, of course, the infinitely many operations within a finite amount of time. So like you were pointing out, you could go from 12 a.m. There could be an interval from 12 a.m. to, let's say, 1 a.m. And then the infinitely many mechanisms are like set for 1 a.m. and then halved between there, so 12:30 and then 12:15 and then so on. So that would be a supertask version. You could have an infinite past version, right? So for the grim messengers, you could have 1 BC and then 2 BC and then 3 BC and 4 BC and so on ad infinitum, where each grim reaper gets a paper from the year previous, the previous year, their Grim Reaper, and they write their number on it if and only if it doesn't have a number on it. So that's a kind of infinite past version. You also have spatial versions, right, that don't even make use of dense time or infinite time, right? Because you could just have the Grim Reaper be positioned at either an infinite array, like infinite wide and spatial extent, and then each Grim Reaper, they operate on the rule that they're going to kill Fred if and only if no Grim Reaper, say, to their left kills Fred, right? So that would also get you the kind of paradox. Or you could have it in a kind of dense space, right? You could have this Grim Reaper right here, this Grim Reaper, and then... So I just want people to recognize that there are a whole host of different kind of variants of it. But like you said, there's this kind of common structure where you have... Well, I know we're going to get into your paper where you talk about when you have those two claims, the A and B, right? You have the infinite set or non-well-founded set where there is no first member. And then you have the kind of rule that's implemented by each member of that infinite set, which is like, perform this operation if and only if the operation is performed nowhere earlier than that, or nowhere somewhere else in the sequence defined by some ordering relation. So can you kind of lay out that general structure that I was just gesturing towards, and tell us the relevance of that to these different variants?
Yeah, okay. I mean, so just to highlight, there's a sort of another dimension to this, which is, of course, I mean, you're talking about like those being arranged in space and time. That's true, and the kind of extendable versus divisible kind of versions of this. I mean, but there's also a kind of semantic version of this too, which Stephen Yablo comes up with in '94, I think, and Roy Sorensen has another paper in 1998 about this as well. So then the version of this goes something like, you just have this like infinitely long sequence of sentences like S1, S2, S3, blah blah blah, and then you say that there's a rule which assigns truth value to these sentences, such that Sn is true if and only if no Sn plus m is true, right? So what we're saying is like, pick S1 That's true if and only if S2 is false, F3 is false, F4 is false, and down the line, right? That's the only way that it's true. Then you get the same paradox, right? Because if S1 is true because none of the others in the sequence are true, fair enough. But what about S2, right? The rule applies to him too. So he's going to look down the line and see, hey, gee, none of the other sentences are true. I must be true. But if he's true, then it was false to say of S1 that when he looked down the line, they were all false. Because like S2, we've just seen he's true. So what you find is that you can't apply. So, okay, the two conditions, the first one is just there's some sequence like that, which doesn't have an end or beginning point, right? Just kind of goes on forever in one direction. And then you've got a rule which applies to it, which says, let's just say some property P is true so this rule applies to each point. So for every point in this sequence, it says some property P is true if and only if P is not true. Any of the other ones for like down the line along that ordering towards the endless direction of that sequence. So it's the most general way of saying it. You've got these two conditions which are incompatible with each other. Now you can cash that out by saying, okay, let's think about them being mechanisms that like do something causal with one another, or it's some kind of, and that causal interaction could be like spatial, it could be temporal, it could be cramming it all into a small space, could be spreading out of an infinitely large space, could be some kind of semantic stuff, whatever. As long as you've got, on the one hand, condition A is saying there's some sequence that's got like no end to it in one direction, and then condition B is just saying there's some proposition P that for all times or all points on that line, proposition P, whatever that is, doesn't really matter what that is, it's true if and only if it's not true at any of the ones further on down that endless sequence. So that's the two aspects of what we're going to call the unsatisfiable pair. So you just can't have both of those true at the same in the same model. There can't be any model of anything, whether that's a causal model or a kind of semantic model or anything. Nothing can satisfy both of those two things. I mean, is it worth talking about causal finitism as well? And
We'll get onto that. But I did just want to point out, I want to highlight for the audience that you can demonstrate a formal contradiction between these two, this unsatisfiable pair. This A and B, you can do it in purely abstract terms without reference to anything like space and time and causation and semantics and things like that. There's a formal deduction that you can just run through, and it's not even all that complicated. And you could just see that these two by themselves in this purely abstract structure are jointly inconsistent. You cannot have them both true. So I did just want to highlight that it's the logical contradiction here is completely independent of causation, the structure of space and time, and semantics and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, so you can prove that those two conditions are incompatible with each other. All such proofs like that are restricted in some way. It's not what some people might complain that it's not a completely formal, it's not a completely sort of purely logical proof. But by purely logical, what they're going to say is something like it has to be expressible purely in terms of the object language of some specific formal language. What this the nature of this claim is more that, I mean, on the one hand, you've got a kind of a claim about a model, right? So we might call that a semantic claim. So that for any structure such that it's, open in one direction, right? That's not normally regarded as a logical claim. It's more a sort of semantic claim or something like that. And then you've got a condition which obtains on those types of models. But that's fine. I mean, like logicians are cool working with things like that. If you prove, like, say, the completeness of a formal theory, you're going to be doing it in terms of some semantic model theoretic terminology like that anyway. So it's fine. It's just some people might split hairs and say, is it a purely logical proof or is it a kind of semantic proof or something? Mm-hmm. It's model theoretic proof. I think that either way, for those people who are not like super into that type of distinction, it's an entirely abstract proof that doesn't require interpreting those structures and what those properties are or whatever in any particular way. You can then go on to interpret it. And then I think what the kind of cool thing about that is the types of models don't really have anything specifically interesting about them. So they could be possible worlds, they could be points in time, points in space, they could be points in some kind of like like the reason that you can apply it to so many different things is because he doesn't really care what the specific details that you're talking about. Like the problem isn't primarily to do with causation, or space or something. It's more abstract than that.
Yeah, and that bridges us nicely into how this has been used, or how these kinds of paradoxes, or the Benedetti paradox, has been used in debates concerning the Kalam and an infinite past and infinite causal chains. So one kind of way to try to kill, or dissolve or diffuse these paradoxes is by means of causal finitism, which is the view that every event or state or substance has a finite causal history. So, or every series or chain of causes is finite, it doesn't have infinitely many members. So can you kind of take us through how this is supposed to work as a solution, and kind of maybe some of the details behind causal finitism, and also how it relates to the Kalam?
Right. So causal finitism. So Proust is quite clear about causal finitism. Causal finitism is kind of a name, but in some ways it's like modal realism. It's sort of misnomer that's ended up sticking. It's more famous than the correction for why it's not the greatest name. But actually, he's clear that what we're talking about really here is dependency finitism. So you can't have infinite chains where one thing is dependent on another, and that thing's dependent on the next thing, blah, 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 and the chain goes down without there being any kind of ground point for that chain of dependencies. So you can have a kind of a dependent chain that's infinitely long as it's got a first point in it. So think about like a kind of hierarchy where you've got like P is true. You've got on the first level P, and then you've got P is true, and then you've got it's true that P is true, and you've got it's true that P is true, blah, blah, blah. And that obviously is just going to go on forever, that type of hierarchy, but it kind of grounds out in the bottom level. It's like P is true, like that. Well, P, that's the thing that like obtains independently, and then everything else, all that scaffolding, just sort of builds off the top of it. What causal finitism or dependency finitism, whatever you want to call it, is ruling out is chains that like the other way around, where you've got something where it depends on the previous thing. It's like turtles all the way down. It has to be like some, you think that has to be some like point that it's resting on at the bottom. And that's what causal finitism is really ruling out, that you don't have chains like that, which is where everything's standing on something, but that there's no like kind of final point to that. And so obviously includes causal chains, because causal chains are a type of dependency claim, right? If something is caused, say something's caused to exist from some other thing, then its existence depends on the previous thing bringing it into existence. So it makes sense to think of causation as a kind of species of dependency there too. So, but obviously, if causal finitism is true, then in addition to there not being, a consequence of there not being chains of dependency that have no kind of ground, it follows that there are no chains of causation that have no like ground, no ungrounded causal chains. What that means is straightforwardly is that there's a first cause for every causal chain that there is. And I mean, what you might suppose is, look, here's an example that Proust gives, which is quite helpful. Imagine there's a ball that's like free falling through the air, and imagine that like space and time are continuous, right? So what that means is that like in between any two points of its motion, there's an infinite amount of points that it moves through. And then it just seems that like, well, pick any kind of infinitesimal point of its journey. At that point, it's got a specific like velocity and it's at a specific position, and that those things seem enough to constitute causes of why it then is at later times found to be some other distance down, free falling down from there. But if that's right, then if each of those are causes, then it just sort of seems to follow that you've got infinitely many causes, just because time and space are infinitely divisible if they're continuous. So what that seems to show you is not just that like causes and dependency and whatnot, chains of dependency have to ground out somewhere, but also that like space and time themselves have to be only finitely divisible. Like there have to be some like stopping point where you can't divide them further. So both space and time, and then also like in extent as well. So as we were just lining out Grim Reapers or whatever, one per year going back. There can only be so many years in which they exist like that. Otherwise, you'd have a beginningless dependency chain. So time must come to a beginning at some point. You can have them lined up in space. So space must come to an end at some point. If you flew off on a rocket ship, you'd get to the edge of space at some point, right? That, at least in principle. More controversially, Yishai Cohen has a version of this where, each Reaper is going to swing his scythe if and only if none of the future ones will do, right? And if that's right, then your time has come to an end as well. So we've got this like kind of all-round finitism about space and time. So it seems to me that it's quite it's not a modest metaphysical theory. It's actually quite whatever the opposite of modest is. It's a kind of ambitious,
and bloated.
Yeah, something like that. It's like a strong claim. It's not just gee, every causal sequence is only finitely long or something. Well, at least if you want to. I mean, you can wriggle around and try and escape some of these consequences by saying, well, what if physics is like this? Maybe blah, blah, blah. And then, okay, that's fine. But what you're going to end up doing is making a lot of ontological claims. You've got to say quite a lot about how things work in order for you, and whatever that is, it's going to have some consequences. Now, that doesn't mean that it's false just because a view has like ontological consequences. But there's this kind of meta theoretical consideration, which is like, look, we've got this paradoxical phenomena going on. What we don't want to do is just say, well, what you could do is like Graham Priest and say, yeah, there are like contradictory things, aspects of the world and whatever. And Priest's got a couple of papers about this, and he basically says this is just another reason to think that like motion is contradictory. I mean, okay, that's one way you can go. Hawthorne says that what it shows you is there's some principle that you have to give up about like, well, the collections of things can have causal powers that go beyond the individual things on their own or whatever. Anyway, so there are these kind of like ideas that you can make an ontological concession, and that will diffuse the puzzle to some extent, right? Like if you think there are contradictions, and that kind of gets rid of some of these. So what you might think is that causal finitism has an ontological cost, but it's so good at killing the paradox, just gets rid of it, like kills 99.9% of paradoxes or whatever, like some spray or something, that it's worth the cost, right? And so what we're talking about here is like, ontological commitments cost you, and explanatory power and neutralizing paradoxes and things like that. The benefits are the things that you get for paying the money in terms of ontology. And what we're looking for, these kind of meta theoretical considerations here, is like trying to work out which theory comes off best with this kind of ratio. Like which theory does the most for the cheapest cost? So causal finitism, it seems to me, has a substantial cost, and it's not even one that the good causal finitists, like Alexander Proust, is not hiding this fact away, quite open about the fact that it has ontological consequences. He just thinks that it's so good, it's worth those consequences. Mm-hmm. I guess maybe I'm not building up to it clearly enough, but one of these consequences that you might see as a cost, but you might see as convenient if it fits in with your theology, is that it tells you, or it seems to tell you, that time has a beginning, right? So if you already think that God created the universe and it has a moment of creation some finite distance into the past, then this is super helpful for you, because it's another way of arguing the same thing. So the Kalam cosmological argument is an argument that has as one of its premises that the universe began to exist. And if causal finitism is a good reason to think, well, if causal finitism is good at neutralizing all of these different types of species of Benedetti paradoxes, including Grim Reaper and such, and if it has a consequence that time has a beginning, then that's one of the things that like makes you think, oh, well, that justifies that premise, right? We're justified in thinking that anyway because of the kind of benefits that it has in ontological cost versus theoretical payoff. So that's kind of one of the ways people these days argue for that premise in the Kalam.
Yeah. And okay, so there are two things that I really want to emphasize or stress or clarify about what you just said. So the first thing is that at least in internet circles, it's often not appreciated that causal finitism does have these significant costs that you were just laying out. All else being equal, we would prefer a solution to these paradoxes that don't bring us into this entire sort of framework of spatiotemporal finitism. You seem, as Proust himself emphasizes, you seem to be bound into saying that, oh, well, space is discrete, not continuous. Time is discrete, not continuous. Well, what about some of our best scientific theories that treat, time as continuous? And, so you're starting to get into all these different weeds. Oh, man, space is finite in extent. Time is finite in extent. What about, all these sorts of ramifications that are increasing your ontological inventory and the ontological costs that you have to pay. And so all else being equal, we would want a non-causal finitist solution to these things, because causal finitism has so many of these costs in terms of its ontological extravagance and what it's going to have to commit us to. And there are certain ways, that as you pointed out, that you can try to wiggle around it. So Proust, in his book Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, as you know, he says that his actual position is that, strictly speaking, causal finitism doesn't entail the discreteness of, say, space. But what he has to do to get around that is he has to take a stance on all these other things within the philosophy of physics. He has to take a stand on the nature of waves and the nature of particles and things like that, things that are highly contentious within philosophy of physics. And so in order to avoid some of these consequences, you have to further add in these different ontological costs. So I did just want to really emphasize that for the audience, that if we can find a different solution that kills the paradoxes, we would prefer that if it has less ontological costs, because causal finitism has so many costs, and that is not appreciated, I don't think, sufficiently within kind of internet circles, at least. But of course, the sort of, the best defenders of it do appreciate that. So that's the first thing that I wanted to emphasize. The second thing that I wanted to emphasize is that, as you know, again, strictly speaking, causal finitism does not entail the finitude of the past, because even though for each chain, that chain is finite, right? We can't conclude that there is some chain in all of reality which is such that that chain is finite, right? So you could have each causal chain overlapping such that each one is finite, but they're overlapping like this infinitely far into the past. So in that way, you would satisfy causal finitism, because each chain is finite. There is no chain such that that single chain is infinitely long. Although the past, under this account, it would be infinite, because you have these things overlapping, going back into the past infinitely. So there are some ways to get around that, because you'd have to, like, what is unifying all these things into one kind of timeline? So I know it's kind of technical, but I did just want to make that clarification that some people have said, oh, well, it automatically proves the finitude of the past. Well, hold on a second. You've got that kind of quantifier shift worry there. So I'll turn it over to you on those two thoughts and then that I just made, and then we'll move on to the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis.
Well, on that second point, I think that's right. It's interesting that Proust says something about how I can't remember exactly how he phrases it, but he says something like it's implausible to suppose that there really would be a way of working that idea out that makes sense. So I think so when it comes to, say, the discreteness of time, he's more willing to say, I can sort of see my way through what the concessions would be to divorce the requirement that causal structures are discrete from the requirement that temporal structures are discrete. You just kind of say something like, maybe causes come in steps, but time itself is continuous underneath that, and you have to work out what the physics would be there. That's why it takes you into coming up with some stance on the nature of fields and blah, blah, blah. But okay, I think he's like saying, I guess I can sort of see how that would work. But for whatever reason, he's less enthusiastic about the idea of saying that causal finitism makes sense without, like, past finitism or something. I think he thinks that it really does just basically get you there, and it's much more difficult to make that claim. So I mean, I'm not quite so interested in that. Sort of feels like a bit of an insider's game. Like, it doesn't really matter to me one way or the other exactly what the details are. I'm not really that interested on exactly how you want to do that. And let's just bear in mind, you take these other views, like Hawthorne's view or Priest's view. Part of the downside to them is that they're only I mean, they require ontological commitments as well, and you might say that priests' commitments are even worse than causal finitism because it's so difficult to understand what it could mean for there to be a contradiction that's true. But not only that, it seems that the account is partial in the sense that it doesn't really even kill off all of the versions of the paradox, because you can just cook versions of them up that don't seem to involve motion in the same way. So even if you say, well, I guess, let's just say motion is contradictory, so Hegelian view of motion, still you're going to have Benedetti paradoxes that you haven't solved. So they haven't solved. So you will have paid this huge ontological price, but you won't really have got your money's worth for it. At least, the thing to say about causal finitism is that I think it's reasonable to think that the cost is cheaper than dialetheism, and it's better at killing. So you get more for your money, right? So it's less money, and you get more for it. So in that sense, it's a good theory. It's not like it's not. I want to put it in the right place among those options on the market. It seems to me that there's only two really prospects for unified theories anyway, i.e. ones that kill off all versions of the paradox. Causal finitism is one of them. So it's a serious contender and needs to be reckoned with seriously as a proper theory or something, right? Like I wouldn't necessarily I'm not going to just discount it. See, there's no reason to discount it. It's a serious way of looking at things.
Yeah.
It's just that it seems to me, until someone can explain it to me differently, that the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis basically has no ontological or no significant ontological costs, and you still get all of the same explanatory benefits. Yeah. And for that reason, it's so much better value that it would be crazy to go the other direction. It's like a no-brainer once the penny drops, it seems to me.
So that's a good bridge. So we've just mentioned this term, unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. So, and this is the other serious contender that a lot of people in the audience may not be aware of. So let's start digging into that solution, which is your favored solution. Let's start digging into that. Explain what this unsatisfiable pair diagnosis is. Maybe connect it to the debates in philosophy of time and time travel, maybe. And so can you kind of unpack this solution for us?
Yeah, okay. So I think the first thing to say about it is the right way to look at it is the response to the paradox is to say, look, it's logically inconsistent that anything instantiates the paradox. And that's the solution at its most simple, right? It's just to say you don't need to concede anything ontologically speaking, because if something's logically impossible, then it can't happen. And that sort of is higher up in the order of explanation than things that are merely metaphysically impossible, right? Because everything logically impossible is also metaphysically impossible. I mean, again, if we don't go the dialectic route, at least, we're not confusing that boundary, as long as we're staying in the kind of classical way of looking at things. And I suppose that concession there, that we stay in a kind of classical way of looking at things, is really the ontological cost to this theory. It seems to me that if you do, then it follows. The unsatisfiable pair diagnosis just follows, just pops out of that classical assumption. And it's a shared assumption with causal finitism. So it's not like causal finitists are typically dialethists. So they also think the law of non-contradiction is true and there aren't any true contradictions. And so then that's why it seems to me that while there might be a cost to it in some sense, as a comparative cost to causal finitism, it's literally zero, because that's the only thing you have to concede. And that's already conceded by causal finitists anyway. So they just have additional ontological costs that that defenders' unsatisfiable pair diagnosis don't share. So we talked about this already, but the pair that's unsatisfiable is, on the one hand, you've got this kind of condition which says that there's some structure, whether that's temporal, or for any structure, whether that's temporal, spatial, causal, semantic dependency, blah, 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 that's open in one direction, it's totally ordered, right? So each pair of things, either one of them is earlier than the other, the other one's earlier than that one. So it's ordered like the natural numbers, basically. and it's open in one direction, again, like the natural numbers. So any structure that has anything that has that amount of structure in it, which could be space or time or whatever, as we keep banging on about, as long as it's got that feature, right, which is open in at least one direction. And then the second thing, call that condition A, then condition B is just saying for all of those points, some proposition P obtains at that point X, if and only if it doesn't obtain at any of the other points running off towards the open direction on that sequence. And then the claim is just, well, look, there's nothing that instantiates both of those conditions at the same time. It's in fact just logically impossible that anything could. So that's why that's the thing that rules out the paradox. You're basically saying if anybody says a story to you, story taken in a kind of loose sense, like imagine there was a load of Grim Reapers and blah, 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 right? And then they could talk to you for 10 minutes and then they say, and see, then at the end of that, there's a contradiction that follows. So that means that the past must be finite or something. The thought is just, look, you've just contradicted yourself along the way of speaking. So nothing instantiates. That's just an impossible world that you're talking about. Now, what they're doing effectively is blaming the A condition. They're just saying the A condition is itself impossible. The defender of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis is only committed to the combination of A and B being impossible. But that doesn't entail that A or B are impossible on their own. So you can be open-minded as to whether there are any sequences which are open towards the past, or whether there are any structures that satisfy the B condition, like some proposition P obtains if and only if none of the other ones in some direction along that kind of sequence. Right? Both of those might independently, there might be possible worlds where those things obtain, but there's no possible world where both of those things obtain. So it's a situation where we've got something that you might think it's like P is possible and Q is possible, but P and Q is not possible. Right, so the combination is not possible.
Yeah, like it's possible that I'm taller than you, and it's possible individually that I'm taller than you. It's possible individually that you're taller than me, but the conjunction isn't possible. We can't both be taller than one another. So yeah. It's like a common phenomenon, right? But what you said there also kind of reminds me of one of Oppie's quips, right? Where it's like you can tell an inconsistent story involving a taxi, but that doesn't mean that taxis are impossible, right? Similarly, you can tell an inconsistent story involving infinity and causation and things like that, but it doesn't thereby mean that actual infinites or infinite causal chains are impossible. And like you said, when they're telling the story, they've actually in an abstract manner, they've just contradicted themselves somewhere, even though they're dressing it up in this garb of the deafening peals or the Grim Reapers and so on. And that's really what the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis kind of brings out.
Yeah, right. Well, I think it's helpful to explain what the objection to this is. So the typical objection made by causal finitists, so I'm thinking in particular people like Lorenzo Luna, Jacobus Erasmus, and Proust are the three that I know have spent words in print arguing this. They'll say, look, the problem with the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, or Proust calls it the absurd conclusion hypothesis, I think, is that so if you have something like, so they'll say something like this, look, what's to stop, like if the past was infinitely long, right, it's endless towards the past, then it just is possible to have a Grim Reaper set up, or infinitely many of them, right, or one that just does the check once every year or something, so that he can check to see if anyone's printed out their date yet and handed it over to them, the past Reaper. It just seems like it is possible for any individual instance. But if that is possible, then you'd get like an infinite chain, each of which says, I'll print out today's date if nobody hands me a date, right? And if I print mine out, I'll hand it over to the next guy. So you've got this kind of chain of dependencies. But then you'll just find that actually the most recent Reaper, or what are we calling these Reapers, date printers would have printed out his day, if none of the previous ones would. But if that's right, then the guy from last year would have printed out his date because none of the previous ones from him would, by just like transitivity or whatever. And you see, we just run into the same problem again. But the thought would be, well, look, what's to stop you setting up these individual mechanisms, right? They're also straightforward and simple. It could be some electrical relay or something could do this. So what you're supposing, they will say, the defender of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis is defended to, or is committed to some implausible claim, right? Which is that like something must interfere and like interrupt this otherwise possible combination of things to make
The
it so that
mysterious force, yeah.
some mysterious force must intervene to prevent it. Like one of the machines must break and not print out its date, even though it's supposed to, or something. And they'll say, well, look, why suppose anything like that would happen? It's not like there's some like Time Lord who's preventing contradictions from happening or something, is intervening or whatever. If the past was infinite, then that sequence of things would be possible, and that's enough to get you into trouble here. So it must be that the past isn't infinite, right? That's the intuition. You kind of just like go, if the past was infinite, then there'd be this possibility in play. And the defender of the cause of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis is saying, if the past was infinite, then it would be impossible for anything to satisfy that B condition. For that, it's impossible that at every point in time, P, if and only if nowhere previously P, right? That's just now impossible if time had no beginning. So that denial is the thing that causal finitists will say is implausible, supposing that it requires a mysterious force to intervene. And I mean, it is kind of similar to the way people talk in the time travel literature, right? About, so if, imagine Tim goes back in time to kill his grandfather who made munitions for the Nazis or whatever, right? Tim trains with a rifle. He's a good shot. It's a clear day, blah, blah, blah. He can see his grandfather coming. Can Tim kill his grandfather? I mean, like, yes, in a way he can, because it's a good shot, it's a clear day, it's a good rifle. Those sorts of conditions obtain that seem to make you think that he can kill him. On the other hand, he can't kill him, because if he did, then he wouldn't have been born, he wouldn't have gone back, blah, blah, blah. It's this familiar grandfather paradox thing here. And, David Lewis has this solution to it where he sort of disambiguates the scope of can in that context, which is kind of a cool solution. But he also has this passage where he says, look, what's going to happen, right? If this story is to play out, right, something's going to happen. He's going to slip on a banana skin, or a bird is going to like get in the way of the bullet, or it'll like hit him, but it won't kill grandfather, and blah, 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 right? So whatever's going to happen to Tim and his grandfather, it's going to be something consistent. But him killing his grandfather just isn't consistent, so that can't be what happens. So anything else will happen apart from that. And people kind of like worry that, it's weird that Tim can almost kill his grandfather, can come so arbitrarily close to killing his grandfather. We can't actually kill him. Right? He can like graze his head with the bullet or whatnot. But you'd feel like he should be able to move the gun like 1 radian of arc or something, in which case the bullet would have actually killed him. But the defender of the possibility of time travel seems to be committed to that somehow not being possible, that like that movement just is logically impossible or whatever. And people complain that seems weird. So that's kind of where it's kind of parallel, right? And I think you can see that both ways. So the trouble with this analogy with time travel is that you get people going, yeah, it's just like time travel, and that's why time travel is impossible. And you get other people going, it's just like time travel, and that's why time travel isn't impossible, because you've got this like solution. So I actually think nowadays that the better example is, and so this comes from a paper on the time travel literature.
So this is the Eulerian circuits, right? The Eulerian circuit? Okay, yeah.
So consider somebody, let's call her Bridget, right, who's trying to cross all of the 7 bridges over the river in Königsberg. Now, this is a problem that Euler solved in the 18th century, I guess. 1730 or something, comes up with this solution to it, I think when he was still a young man. But what he showed was that like it's not possible. There's no pathway across the bridges such that you'll cross all of them and you won't double back on yourself. Right? It's just simply not possible to do that. And there's nowadays mathematicians would say that's just because like it makes a non-Eulerian circuit, and basically, without going into the details of like graph theory or whatever, I mean, you can Wikipedia it, it's kind of fun to look at. But there's a relatively straightforward understanding there that like that's just not like mathematically possible or like kind of geometrically possible to conduct such a circuit. Now, it's not just a proof that applies just to one city somewhere. What it does is it sort of defines a type of structure and says, there aren't any um, pathways along a structure like that, right? That's just a thing you can't have, because basically you end up having a contradiction if you suppose that there can be. I mean, that's the ultimate analysis of it. It's inconsistent to suppose that you can make a pathway across all of the bridges without doubling back on yourself. But now the good thing about this as an example is, like, firstly, it's a mathematical proof, right? But secondly, nobody thinks that there's a mysterious force that's stopping Bridget from being able to complete this circuit, right? And it's true, if you actually did watch what she was doing, she might slip on a banana skin, or she might, get bored and go home, or she might fall into the river, or might double back on herself without realizing it. Something will happen, but it won't be that she completes the circuit. It also won't be that, she turns into a square circle or whatever, right? We know that those things won't happen because we're making this kind of classical assumption that there aren't any contradictions. So whatever's going to happen, it will be consistent. Now, it's not Euler's burden of proof to say which of those things would happen if she tried it. And we're kind of weird to think that you had to give an answer for that. Something might happen, but it's nothing to do with the mathematician on a given day, what somebody does in a German city somewhere, right? And I think that something similar can be said here about the mysterious force objection, right? Like, I mean, okay, so let's imagine we're trying. I mean, it's not even clear what the scenario is supposed to be really in any kind of level of detail, but like, there aren't going to be infinitely many reapers lined up in that specific way. Each of them faithfully fulfills the intention to, issue a death warrant if and only if none of the previous ones do. Right? That just isn't. We know that because it's logically impossible for that to happen. And then the person with the mysterious force objection might say, "But what would happen, though? Like, I mean, you're going to tell me what would happen." Well, now think about it in terms of possible worlds, right? Over here, we've got, like, in modal space, we've got like all of the possible worlds over here. So the whole entire realm of possible worlds. And you might think they're kind of surrounded by kind of Oort cloud of impossible worlds, which are just all floating around, like with these round squares and, whatever, contradictions, P and not P, floating around in them. Now, it might be, depending on how you think possible worlds are ordered in terms of similarity or whatever that metric is, you might think for any two worlds or any three worlds, there's some fact about which of the first two is most similar to the third one. You might think that that's right, you might not. But it seems deeply implausible to suppose that for any two possible worlds and an impossible world, there's some fact about which one of those two is the closest to that world, or to suppose that there's some uniquely closest world out of all of the possible worlds to that impossible world. It might just be that there is no such answer to that question. And it's just not my problem, right? If there is or there isn't. I don't care whether there's an answer to what would happen. It doesn't make any difference to me. Like, no more than what would happen if Bridget tried to cross all of the bridges. I mean, it just doesn't make any difference to the person. So all you're advancing is it's logically impossible that she succeeds. And the same thing, it's logically impossible that both of those A and B conditions obtain. And I think that kind of, I don't know, diffuses to some extent this thought, which was always quite hand-wavy and based on intuition anyway, and really puts the emphasis back on the person making the mysterious force objection to see why. Do they think that there's a mysterious force needed in the Eulerian circuit example? And if not, why not? Why is that different to this one? And it seems to me that there's no real prospect for distinguishing those two, such that one of them requires a mysterious force and the other one doesn't. So I think that's actually more helpful than the time travel example, just because people will say, "Oh yeah, that proves Time Lords must be preventing contradictions or something," right? Whereas nobody thinks that about Eulerian circuits.
Yeah. I mean, I also really share kind of your intuition or your kind of line of reasoning here. I mean, I like to start with clear cases, and so, like, clear-cut cases. And I think one clear case is if we return to that taller than example, right? So if we suppose that let's take the two conditions, A and B. A, in this case, will be you are taller than me, and then B in this case will be I am taller than you, okay? Now, under our unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, if we're going to take that here, we're just going to say no, it's just logically impossible for both of those. Maybe not logically. It's impossible for both of those to be satisfied, taller than, setting those things aside. But it's just not possible for those things to be satisfied together. Now, suppose we've already granted that we're limiting the space of possible worlds to worlds in which A is satisfied. That is, you are taller than me. I think that's what it was, right? So you are taller than me. Well, in some of these worlds, like, yeah, maybe I'm just going to have a birth defect and I'll be really short. Maybe in another world, I'll come like 1 centimeter within your height.
Yeah.
In another world, I'll come 1 millimeter within your height. In another world, maybe I die at the age of, I don't know, 12 or something. Who knows, right? But there's no mysterious force operative here that's like preventing me in this space of possible worlds. There's no mysterious force that's preventing me from becoming taller than you. And I can become arbitrarily close to you in this space of possible worlds. And some of them might be 0.0001 like picometers shorter than you, right? So like, I'm just imagining someone saying, well, like, oh, so you're trying to tell me that in these worlds where A is satisfied, where Alex is taller than Joe, you mean to tell me that Joe can get 0.0001 picometers away from his height, but he can't surpass him? And I'm just like, yes, I'm telling you that, because it's logic, right? I don't know. It just seems clear to me that when we consider this case, this unsatisfiable pair, there doesn't need to be any mysterious force. Like, in different worlds, there'll be a different explanation. And one of them will get a birth defect. And one of them I'll die at 12. And another one I'll just, and so on, right? So that's how I don't know. When I consider that case, that's really what brings the force of what you're saying out to my mind. So now maybe at this point we want to transition to Koons's or other people's appeal to patchwork principles, which is this kind of modal epistemological and kind of modal metaphysical tool, where you kind of scissor in different possibilities into, well, I'll let you explain it, so I'll turn it over to you. I've covered this on my channel before in my response to Trent Horn, and I was building on some of your work and things like that. So I'll turn it over to you to explain this kind of Patchwork principle, how it relates to this, and how you respond.
Okay, good. So the idea is, again, it's one of these things where people trace it back to Lewis, but it clearly goes back further than that, though I haven't done any research to know where people think this originates from, really, historians of philosophy. But the contemporary literature goes back to Lewis, and specifically as his paper Survival and Identity, where he's responding to Derek Parfit. But he really outlines it there, and he develops it a bit further in his most famous book, The Plurality of Worlds. And in that, Lewis says something like this: look, what he's doing is talking about like the plentitude of possibilities, and how many worlds there are. And he has this idea that it's kind of complete, that there's no kind of arbitrary or ad hoc spaces in the realm of possible worlds. So he says something like, look, broadly speaking, the thought is that anything can exist with anything else. And anything can fail to exist with anything else. So like if you've got, if it's possible that there's a unicorn and it's possible that there's a dragon, then there has to be another world where there's both a unicorn and a dragon. It would be weird if, they were just randomly absent from the space of possible worlds. So it kind of like sort of complete in that sense. So that's generally taken as a kind of combination or recombination principle. Like you've got one thing over there and you've got another thing over there, provided some kind of provisos, then you should be able to pop them together and make a third possibility that has both of them together. So generally speaking, provisos are going to be quite minimal, but you're going to want to say something like, look, they can't like completely overlap. Like it doesn't really make sense to think, there's a possible world where there's me and there's a possible world where there's you. But is there a distinct possible world where you and I occupy exactly the same space? It doesn't really seem, there's some mistake there about what we're trying to suppose. There definitely is one where, I exist over there and you exist like a meter away or something. Like there's really no reason to think that that's not, broadly speaking, possible, right? So Koons likes this principle and thinks of it as a kind of guide to what possibilities there are. So it's not a metaphysics of modality principle. It's not what are possibilities. Are they linguistic creations, concrete entities, ersatz, blah, blah, blah. It's not what are possibilities. It's what possibilities there are. It's a guide to how, which things are possible and which things are not. And broadly speaking, the idea is if you can get one thing overlap and combine it in a non-overlapping way with something else, then the result should be possible. And so what he does is basically says, look, take that principle, assume for reductio, his idea is that there's a world which is beginningless towards the past. Now find a world where there's a Grim Reaper, which is, as we talked about before, can be interpreted quite loosely as a kind of mechanism where it does something, if and only if some input is given to it. And then just cut and paste that infinitely many times so that it fills at regular intervals the whole of the past in that first world. And that's just an application of this, he calls it a patchwork principle. Other people call it a combination principle, recombination principle. I quite like the words rearrangement principle, but whatever. You could call it cut and paste principle if you like. And it basically means the same thing. As long as they're cut from things that are individually possible, they don't overlap with each other, and you've got a container that you can fit them in so that they don't overlap, then you should have something that's possible in the end. And so he says, well, the problem is if you do that, then you find that you've got yourself into a Grim Reaper, you've got yourself into a Benedetti paradox, because now each of the Grim Reapers is going to print out today's date, if and only if none of the previous ones do. Today's one's going to do it because none of the previous ones have. But if that's right, then yesterday's one would have done it as well. You're back in that contradictory kind of setup that we've talked about previously. So it feels like, well, I mean, from my point of view, no surprise that you've derived a contradiction from it because you've satisfied both the A and B conditions, right? But Koons thinks that what's gone wrong here is we've assumed that there is a beginningless past for reductio, and that all of the other steps in the argument are untouchable. So it must be that you have to blame this first step, right? So building on what we were talking about a moment ago, with unsatisfiable pair diagnosis person, UPD guy, is going to say, well, I mean, hold on a minute here. Not only is there a proviso that you can't recombine things in such a way that they like completely overlap with each other, that seems right, but also you can't recombine things in such a way that you end up with something that's contradictory. So as you were talking about, or Yablo's example, it's quite similar. I can be thinking of a number greater than the number that you're thinking of, and you can be thinking of a number greater than the number that I'm thinking of. But that doesn't mean that we can cut and paste those bits of those possible worlds and then, paste them back into a third world where it's true that both of us are thinking about numbers greater than the other one's number. So obviously there must be a restriction on this, which says cutting and pasting, but not where what you end up with is contradictory, like logically contradictory. And it's almost like goes without saying proviso, because if you think the law of non-contradiction is true, then obviously that's right. There's no use having a guide to what's possible that sometimes shows you into the impossible. That's just not like a bad guide if that happens. So obviously you need to have a kind of restriction on it. Now, someone might say you can't restrict the rearrangement principle. It just seems like, well, Lewis himself restricted it with the overlapping stuff. Also, Lewis is like famously defends the law of non-contradiction. And I think if we'd had a conversation with him, he would have said, yeah, obviously you can't combine things in such a way that you end up with contradictions, right? It seems to me that it's not really an additional restraint or something, constriction on this principle. It's actually a sensible, always was there anyway, but we didn't say it out loud because it just seemed like it goes without saying kind of restriction. But what's interesting about this is that actually Koons doesn't endorse an unrestricted version of this cut and paste principle. We know this because causal finitism is a restriction on that principle too, right? You can't cut and paste anything into an infinite chain.
As is theism, right? Theism itself has to build in restrictions because you can't cut and paste horrendous suffering for an infinite amount of time for an infinite amount of creatures that's all they're experiencing, because then no God would actualize such a world. So like you have to build in certain constraints on that with theism as well.
That's right. And Proust has this version of the Grim Punisher, right, where it's so you imagine the Grim Punisher has a dial that he can set to take any value, any real number value between 0 and 1, let's say. And what happens is, as it gets closer to 1, it dishes out an increasingly large electric shock to the next guy, like without limit. So it sort of converges on infinite amount of energy being poured into him. Now, dials can be set, right, at any interval between 0 and 1. Like I say, it's some perfect frictionless like dial or whatever. And it's up to him to dish it out. Like if someone like gives him some like social like fumble or whatever, accidentally calls him by the wrong title or something, he's gonna like go around dishing the dial right up towards 1 here, almost infinite electric shocks right now. Now, Proust thinks that there couldn't be anything like that because it's just incompatible with justice. No good God would allow any such thing to happen. On the other hand, it all the example really requires is modifications, cuts and pastes, slight rearrangements of things that seem to be possible. So they both endorse quite substantial and seems to me far less plausible restrictions on rearrangement. I mean, after all I was saying was you can't recombine things such that they end up with contradictions, and presumably Proust and Koons and other causal finitists, in that they're not dialetheists, also agree with me. So I don't think it's an additional constraint on top of what they already believe anyway. It just seems to me you don't have to also go on and make further constraints. I mean, I guess you do if you also want to believe in a God who makes sure that no unjust things happen or whatever, but like just to get out of these types of paradoxes, I'm not making what seems to be an ad hoc restriction on the rearrangement principle. Actually, it should be a restriction that's endorsed by these guys too.
Yeah. And I mean, I was just thinking as well that, well, like, surely we can use a similar Patchwork principle and we just patch up a non-contradictory infinite chain, right? So like just have the Grim Reapers pass each other a blank sheet, and that's all that they're doing. So
Yeah.
it seems as though that we could just patch this up and we don't even get a contradiction here. And it's an infinite causal chain. And, well, I don't know. It just seems as though, and so they themselves are going to have to kind of reject this application of the principle because they
That's
are
right.
causal finitists. So I don't know. It seems to me that, like, as you were saying, I think even the slight restriction on it, let's just respect logical consistency and not have contradictions within our Patchwork principle, that we have to have that proviso. It seems to me that is in an even better position than, as you were talking about, even better position than the proponents of the causal finitist arguments here.
Yeah. So you could imagine some patch of space that's like deep in intergalactic void or whatever, where there's basically nothing happening, as close to nothing happening as you can get, like, and just copy and paste that over and over again infinitely many times. There's no causal, as next to no causal interaction as you can possibly get. Some background quantum foam murmuring or whatever, but there's no like asteroids or alien spaceships or like whatever. It's just nothing really. It does seem like it's hard to see what's wrong with that, right? And the worry is what these guys are doing is a kind of guilt by association, right? Like, okay, even if you think causal chains filling infinite space is bad because there's this ungrounded dependency, why blame the infinite chain, right? Why not just blame the combination of that with the dependencies? Otherwise, you've got something that seems like it can take on innocent forms, like this just cut and paste in empty space infinite amounts of times. And it just seems weird to say you can't have that, even though there's nothing wrong with that, just because it's kind of like this other version of space where it would be filled with reapers or whatever. So I do tend to think that that's the beginnings of I guess, I don't know whether you want to move into this, but there's this other type of attack on. I mean, so just to be clear, right? I reject the premise in Koons's argument where he says, well, we've got all these Grim Reapers independently existing in different possible worlds. Well, now we can just apply the rearrangement principle, and then we've put them all in this world that has no beginning. I just think that that's not possible. I mean, that step is abusing the rearrangement principle, and I don't think that can be used like that. And so there's the false premise, right? It's like premise 4 of his argument or something. I just think that's false. I deny it because it's an application of the rearrangement principle that violates the principle of non-contradiction. So like it has to go. And I mean, one thing to say about this is like, so I've got this kind of like Humean like modesty argument or something, right? Where, Benedetti doesn't like causal finitism, even though no one was really calling it that at that point. He just doesn't like the idea that the consequence of his paradoxes is that you can just say embrace like finitism in lots of different ways and just say, well, if that's finite and this is finite and that's finite, blah blah blah, then none of these paradoxes pop up. And he says, look, it's just crazy to think that that it's impossible that you could just keep going through in a rocket ship through space without ever reaching an edge. To think that it's impossible and that you could know that a priori from the armchair just by considering some like paradox or whatever, and you've determined that about the way that the world is. He just thinks that's fatuous and just like it couldn't possibly be, right? So it's kind of gross, over-ambitious use of your own intellect to deduce such an a priori conclusion about the way that the world is. Right? He's like a keep your mind open and don't think you've figured it out kind of guy, not a I've a priori sorted out what the world is like from my armchair kind of guy. And I think that like you don't have to quite go as far as that, but you do have to sort of weigh up on the one hand, like what do you think's more like, what should you think is more likely, and what this principle of like modesty should like lead you towards thinking. That on the one hand, you've managed to succeed in this stupidly ambitious a priori project of determining loads of different aspects of the world, all based on reflections on one type of paradox. Or you misused a principle of the epistemology of modality, which was telling you that things very distinct from your everyday experiences were possible. Maybe you just went wrong and that was leading you astray. And it just seems to me that it's much more, I don't know how I'm quantifying this in terms of probability, certainly not frequency or anything, but modesty should at least lead you to think, until I've figured out for sure that I haven't made kind of mistake about the epistemology of modality, probably shouldn't rush to the conclusion that I've definitely established all of this stuff in metaphysics. It's just kind of modesty or humility or something should lead you to say that. Now, I think that's quite a powerful argument, but it's certainly not a kind of deductive. It's not a modus tollens argument. It seems to me that it's quite persuasive, right? You should just sort of hang fire and not be too ambitious about it, like keep your powder dry or something. So yeah, should we move more into the guilt by association? I mean, I'm happy to go in any direction you want, really.
Yeah, let's move into that a little bit further. I couldn't take that modus tollens one. That was so good. For the audience, the video that we did with Graham Oppie and Alex Malpass and I that on the reviewing the Loc Oppie discussion, maybe that will be posted sometime this week. It won't be on it won't be on my channel, just so you guys know. We're gonna do it on Alex's channel called Thoughtology, so you'll find a link in the description. So yeah, let's go on to the guilt by association that you wanted to touch on there. So
yeah, okay. So we started talking about it already, which is like, the causal finitist basically, the funny thing about this, the causal finitist basically agrees with everything that I'm saying up until where I draw the conclusions about it, because they don't dispute that it's logically impossible to satisfy both of those conditions. They think it is. I mean, that's how they derive the contradiction in the Grim Reaper paradox. What they really disagree about is what we should think about that. So they think the thing to blame is the A condition, whereas I'm saying the thing to blame is the combination of the A condition and the B condition. So one way that Proust tries to push back against this, so I already think that's kind of guilt by association, because why think A is to blame, right? Just because when he gets together with B, there's trouble, doesn't necessarily mean A is to blame, right? It's like if you have two naughty kids at school or whatever, they might be well behaved on their own and you just shouldn't put them together, right? That's not any one of them individually that's to blame. It's just their combination that's to blame. I think that's the right way to look at this. So blaming A already seems a bit like guilt by association for that reason. But Proust develops this further by saying, look, Think about this story. Let's call it the reverse Grim Reaper story. Um, so in the original one, we've got it that so we've got our interval, which is 12 till 1, right? So there's the last Reaper is at 1 o'clock. Then there's one before him at 12:30, and one before him at 12:15, and one before him at 7.5 minutes past 12, blah, 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 in a kind of converging sequence towards 1 o'clock, towards 12 o'clock. And the problem is that this sequence has no beginning, no first member, but each of them's dependencies and points down the chain here. But if we just reverse the way that they're laid out, and Proust thinks about it like this, imagine that they're setting alarm clocks which wake them up at some point. And when they wake up, they immediately check to see if Fred is still alive and kill him straight away if he is. Now, it might be that by chance they set their alarm clocks like that so that there's no first Reaper, right? Might be, there's infinitely many of them. They could end up by chance setting them all like that. And if they did, then there'd be a paradox because, it's a Grim Reaper paradox, right? On the other hand, if they could set their alarms by chance to be a different direction, right? It might be that the earliest Reaper happens to wake up at 12:30, and then the next earliest Reaper is at 1:45, and then the next earliest Reaper is halfway between that and 1, and blah, 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 right? So it's still a sequence that kind of converges, but this time, instead of converging in the past, it converges towards some point in the future, and there is a first point. The fact that there's a first point means he's going to wake up and kill Fred. All of the other ones wake up, find Fred's already dead, and go back to sleep again, or whatever, right? So there's no paradox there. But then he says, look, all they're doing is like tinkering with their alarm clocks, and they're independent from each other. They're not like talking to each other as they do it. So there's no reason to suppose that if one of those scenarios is possible, that the other one's impossible. Well, if one of them's impossible, that the other one's possible, right? What we should think is that they both live or stand or fall together, right? If one of them's possible, the other one's possible. And this is why I think is really the guilt by association argument. So, well, maybe you can anticipate this. I guess you read this thing already. So, how do you think about this argument?
Well, when you sent your most recent version of the paper that was slightly revised, or maybe more than slightly, but when you sent that one to me, I skimmed it because I had already read the previous versions. So I haven't looked into this one in depth. What I'm thinking when I hear this is like, I'm just going to go back to one of my earlier responses. It's just like, if we're limiting the space of possible worlds to the ones where you are taller than me, even in these worlds, my height is independent of yours. It's not like my height somehow depends causally on yours, or that there's some mysterious force, and it's completely independent of you. And we can just suppose that there are these birth defects that happen in one world, or in another world something else happens, right? And these are independent of you. And so, I don't know, logic forbids it. Like, that's what's doing the work here. But I'm curious to hear how you kind of go about it. Presumably, it's similar to how we've responded thus far, but maybe it takes us beyond that. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, okay. So the thought here is like, look, let's call it the original Grim Reaper story for the sake of this, is that they set their alarms such that there's no earliest one that wakes up. And then the reversed story is that they set their alarms, but there is an earliest one. They converge towards 1 o'clock instead of converging towards 12 o'clock. And we can also think of a prefixed Grim Reaper story, which is just like the original one, where there's no earliest Reaper. It's converging towards 12 o'clock. But we just add a singular Reaper at like 1 second to 12, like 11:59 and 59 seconds. And as long as he's there, actually, there's nothing impossible about that situation at all. So there's this kind of like almost the same situation, but with a slight change to it. And it just seems like, well, that's not logically impossible anymore. And so Proust says, look, so then there's no reason to say that that's impossible. So you should think that it's possible, but you also think that this scenario that's sort of next door to it in modal space is impossible. The original Grim Reaper story, but without the prefixed first guy. And they're so similar to each other, those stories, that it's implausible to suppose that one of them is possible and the other one is impossible.
Oh, so are you going to say that there isn't really a measure between impossible worlds and the possible worlds that are closeness? Is that what you're going to say, like in terms of closeness?
Well, this does seem like it's a handy way to it's a plausible looking measure, at least. I mean, we're talking about like variation over a distance and setting up occupations of those points by things. So, well, that's one way to look at it. I mean, yeah, I suppose I could develop the point I was arguing before, which is that it's not quite so straightforward that what you're looking at really is something that's close by, and there are ways to mount arguments that would disrupt the metric there. So that's not what I was thinking about with this, though. My view here is to say something like this. Look, let's take the defender of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis is really just committed to one very modest claim, which is that the combination of A and B is impossible. It's a logically inconsistent combination. So it follows from a very, very straightforward principle of modality, which is just that anything logically impossible is metaphysically impossible. As long as you buy that, then you've got that the combination of anything satisfying both the A and B conditions is metaphysically impossible, right? But they don't have to be committed to anything else, actually. And, it's not part of the defender of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis hypothesis that A and B are, in fact, metaphysically possible. As we talked about a moment ago, you might be led to thinking that and a beginningless sequence of like nothing patched onto nothing forever is possible. You might think, well, the rearrangement principle tells me that that's possible. Yeah, maybe, but I'm already kind of skeptical about how helpful that is as a guide to possibility, right? We already saw that it led us astray, or it leads some people astray. And Arthur Pryor has a nice point about this, which is like, sometimes you might think that something's possible only for logic to teach you that it isn't, and your intuition about what's possible has to really give way to logic on this. So you don't have to come into this part of the dialectic fully committed to any of the Grim Reaper scenarios being metaphysically possible. It seems to me you can be agnostic about that. I mean, what compelling argument is there, seems to me, to suppose that any of those Grim Reaper scenarios is metaphysically possible? They might all, for some reason I don't know about, be metaphysically impossible. All I know, the kind of shining light of reason, is that the one that's obviously logically inconsistent is definitely not metaphysically possible. And if they...
Hello. Oh no, we froze. Oh no, are you back?
I'm back. I am back.
Oh man, yeah. Okay, I will cut that out. So I was just hearing you talk about how, like, we can remain agnostic on these kinds of, these other possibilities, right? Like the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis only needs to say that you cannot have both of those because it's logic, and logic oftentimes corrects our intuitions. So you can continue there.
Okay, so the thought is that the core aspect of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis is just that this kind of light of reason shows you that the logically inconsistent combination is metaphysically impossible. But you don't have to suppose that it also illuminates the seemingly nearby scenarios and tells you that they are metaphysically possible. Unless you think the rearrangement principle does definitely tell you that, in which case I'm already probably parting company with you if you trust the rearrangement principle so much that it, for sure that infinitely many mechanisms can actually be deployed in such a way that blah, blah, blah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, for one thing, is there a proof of the consistency? Show me that first, and then we definitely know that it's not also ruled out by as another example of some inconsistency. Let's assume that it is, in fact, logically consistent. Then, what's the thing that actually compels you to say that it's metaphysically possible? I'm just not aware of any kind of proper calculus of determining what's metaphysically possible and what's not. So it just seems to me that what you can do is just say, listen, buddy, I didn't say that yeah, anything about what's metaphysically possible. All I'm really saying is something inconsistent is logically impossible and therefore metaphysically impossible. It's not part of my claim that anything nearby is also that something like very nearby is metaphysically possible. If I was committed to that, then maybe I would have a puzzle to sort out. Maybe, but I'm no, nothing about the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis requires that I take a positive stand on any of those seemingly nearby possibilities. So the first thing to say is that you can just sort of shrug your shoulders when he says, "Oh, but the reversed scenario is metaphysically possible, isn't it?" You can say, "Well, it doesn't seem logically inconsistent to me, but there's a big gulf between what's logically consistent and what's metaphysically possible. So it's, I still don't know whether it's metaphysically possible or not. I mean, it kind of seems like it, but that's really a loose commitment on my part."
Yeah.
And if he says, look, the, the combination of thinking that the reversed scenario is possible and that the combination of A and B is impossible is a mark against the theories, the phrase that Proust uses, a mark against the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. This is a version of the mysterious force objection, really, because he's saying, look, it's weird, isn't it, that you can't set the alarms in one way, but you could in a different way. I mean, it would be weird if I was committed to it definitely being possible for infinitely many Reapers to set infinitely many alarms and instantaneously kill Fred and blah, blah, blah. But I don't know that I am, really. I mean, it's fun to think about, but who am I to say, really, for sure about that? So I can just sort of back away from that claim. But let's just say, I mean, even to play the game a little bit, at some point you have to, there has to be a cutoff between things that are possible and things that are not. So do you think it's weird that you can't cross all of the bridges, the 7 bridges of Königsberg, without doubling back on yourself, even though were I to take, 10 bricks off each bridge and build a little pontoon bridge to make an 8th one, then you could cross over all of the bridges without doubling back on yourself, right? So is that weird? Should I think that the prefixed bridge scenario that we've just come up with there is any reason to think that you can't cross all of the 7 bridges?
Yeah.
I don't think that it does. I don't think there's any reason at all to think that.
Yeah, or like slightly rearrange some of like the borders and things like that, because we're talking about like maps and graph theory and things like that.
Right.
So if you just slightly rearrange some of the borders, you would be able to like do things like that.
So, exactly. Yeah. Well, if you do anything that results in it being if you just do anything that makes it an Eulerian graph, you're in business, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Anything that makes it a non-Eulerian graph, then it's not. And there has to be a cutoff there somewhere. And maybe this is the cutoff, right, between metaphysical possibility and logical possibility. I mean, I'm not sure I'm armed with any intuition at all about what the cutoff is between those things and whether it should be like this or like that. And so this really does seem to me quite a weak objection.
Yeah.
Here, it's a kind of baseless guilt by association. It kind of trades on me mistaking my own burden of proof in this argument. Mm-hmm. And I'm suddenly defending the metaphysical possibility of the prefixed Grim Reaper scenario, which is obviously not part of anything essential to what I want to say about the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. So I actually think this can be batted away rather straightforwardly.
I mean, I also agree with you, but let's just suppose that objection worked, right? I mean, they themselves don't take it as a kind of knockdown thing, right? It's just a kind of like puzzle, right? I mean, it would be, they say it's usually unintuitive or a little bit strange or weird that you can have these very slightly altered scenarios that are, well, your view doesn't say that they're possible. You don't take a stance on that, but they're going to say, well, yeah. So that's where your objection comes in. But they're going to say well, you can have these slightly altered scenarios that are possible, but this one is impossible. You could, I mean, even ignoring your response to that and ignoring some of the things that I said before your response to that, we could, I mean, I'm just thinking we could grant this and we could say, okay, fine, let's treat it as a theoretical cost. But I mean, come on, look at the costs of causal finitism, this huge spatiotemporal finitist research program, research paradigm, really. You have all these commitments about the past, the future, space, density, continuity, things like that, the nature of fields and things like that. You have all these sorts of commitments. Whereas over here, we've just got these kind of faint intuitions about possibilities that are way beyond our ordinary experience.
Yeah, that's
and it's slightly puzzling.
and like
And
which ones they should be nearby in possible
and
world
now we're talking
space or
about
whatever.
nearby possible worlds, nearby to impossible worlds, right? So
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, even if we granted that this is a theoretical cost, and that's ignoring both of the things that we said, even granting that this is a theoretical cost, it just seems clear to me that causal finitism is still the worst solution compared to the unsatisfiable paradiagnosis.
Yeah, that's right. And another way of casting this thought would be to say, let's say I was a faithful advocate of the rearrangement principle, and that's what led me to think that I could rearrange things to generate the reversed Grim Reaper scenario. So that's one where the first Reaper wakes up at 12:30, the next one at 1:45, the next one on that, so it converges towards 1 o'clock. So there's an earliest Reaper. And let's suppose you thought, well, I think that's metaphysically possible because each of those on their own is metaphysically possible, and the rearrangement principle leads me to rearrange. Just tells me that their rearrangement in that way is metaphysically possible. And then Proust comes along and says, aha, but it's nearby the original Grim Reaper scenario where they converge towards 12 o'clock, and that leads to a paradox. So here we've got a mark against the theory. I think it just doesn't seem to me, I don't understand why you can't say, yeah, it is a mark against the theory, against the rearrangement principle. So unrestricted, naive application of that rearrangement principle. So it's just another reason to think that you shouldn't believe that principle, right? So it's even if you thought it's a mark against a theory, it's still open which theory it is that it's a mark against. And nothing really pushes you towards saying it's a mark against the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis or a mark against, a mark against unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. There are options here. So it just,
And
it does
it's
not
also a
satisfy
really
that at all.
it's also a really faint mark too. I mean, like I'm saying, like these we're talking about things that are possibilities, so they're not actualities. They're well beyond ordinary experience, our humdrum things of, like moving chairs around in rooms and things like that. I mean,
Mhm.
it's even if it's a mark, it's such a faint mark too. I don't know. I just yeah.
Yeah,
But
and
go
so
on.
one last thing is that Koons sells this rearrangement principle as like the main way that we have access to non-actual possibilities, epistemologically speaking. It's how we know which things are possible and which things are not possible. But that's not the only game in town for that, right? Like there are other views on the market, and Philippe Lyon's view, which is also like Peter van Inwagen's view, would be a kind of skepticism about your modal knowledge, the extent to which you can have that. And that view kind of grounds the modal knowledge you have in humdrum everyday claims. So it's, things like if something's actual, then it's possible, stuff like that. And as further it goes away from grounding things in what's actual and like in front of you and knowable, the more you kind of end up going, I don't know if that's possible or not. And what we're talking about here, if you take that view, which seems kind of independently, you might hold that something like that, then what we're talking about is by definition going to be something very, very far away from everyday understanding. And you should feel unsure, like less confident. And so this sort of feeds back into that epistemic humility point I was making before. Much more, I mean, I'm inclined to think that I just don't know about those things. How could I? Some schmuck like me, how am I going to know anything about that, right? Oh, I shouldn't trust my intuitions of like revealed the nature of the world to me or whatever. Much more likely that I've just fucked up somehow and like confused myself and gone wrong. Like that's much more likely. This is why I think about it as a Humean argument, because it's sort of similar to this like miracles argument or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
No,
that's
that's
probably
good. I mean, I guess one final thing, maybe to before we close off this episode, one final thing I do want to touch on that you sort of you hinted at earlier on, but it's the kind of future-oriented Grim Reaper paradox. So, like I think you have a blog post on this. The quantifier shift that's been spotted numerous times in your blog posts.
it's true.
So, according to this future-oriented paradox, right? Well, we could have a Grim Reaper which, kills Fred if and only if no future Grim Reaper kills Fred, things like that. So
Hmm.
can you sort of take us through this, whether or not this might help us get a kind of future-oriented finitism? And of course, that would pose problems
Okay.
for Christianity, according to which there's this kind of infinite future in heaven and afterlife and things like that. But setting that aside, can you kind of take us through this future-oriented approach and how some people have responded to it? Like, Koons, I think he says, how would they have access to this knowledge? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a couple of papers in the literature that talk about this notion of like symmetry in relation to arguments that support the Kalam. So obviously, there's something. Kalam arguments seek to establish that the past has a beginning, right? But typically, defenders of the Kalam don't hold that the future must have an end. Some of them, I guess, do because they'll have a theology which means that the end times really is the end of time itself or something. Fine, okay, fair enough. But typically, that's not the view. And instead, the idea is that time can continue going forever without end. And that's like, you could, or an angel or something, or in your afterlife, you could start counting, and there's no number such that you couldn't count to it. You could just keep going and going and going. So, in that way, it's an asymmetric metaphysics, right? Because you've got a beginning, but you don't have an end in time. And that commitment to something asymmetric invites this kind of pushback, which is to say that the logical arguments that seek to establish one end of that asymmetry can be kind of repurposed by modifying them systematically to point them at the future, such that they should, if you believe one of them establishes the beginning of time, then subtle modification to that argument, but basically you should agree that it also tells you that time has an end as well as a beginning. And that forces this kind of uncomfortable balancing act where the person making the original claim has to see which of their beliefs they revise. Do they bite the bullet and say, yeah, you're right, time must come to an end too? Do they say, oh yeah, you're right, that must mean that time didn't have a beginning as well? Do they smooth out the compromise by making it symmetrical in either of those two ways? Or do they say, no, there's a symmetry breaker between those two options, a third route, which is to retain the asymmetry they have by pointing out something that stops one of the arguments, the one that points towards the future, while maintaining the one that points towards the past. So that's a kind of, very high level, explaining this kind of dialectic. And me and Morriston's paper is one example of that. But Yishai Cohen has this nice paper where he explains some other ways of looking at those types of views, and he applies it to the Grim Reaper paradox. So in it, so let's just take the version where it says, there's a Grim Reaper one per year who issues a death warrant for Fred if and only if one hasn't been issued already. So what's going on there is that you've got a condition which is pointed towards the past. So each Reaper is going to do something if and only if none of the ones that came before him have already done it. And Cohen just says, well, okay, I'm just going to have it so that each of them is going to issue a death warrant for Fred if and only if none of the future ones will. All we've done is change the word past to future and the words like things like was to will and things like that. So what we're doing is just touching up the argument. We're retensing the argument, or other words similar to that. There's no real technical term for this, but we're just changing the tenses of it systematically throughout the argument to keep everything else the same. And then the thought would be, well, just changing the tense of this argument shouldn't make it that one of them is logically valid and the other one's logically invalid. How is that? Change of tense should be neutral. You should preserve deductions or whatever. It shouldn't be significant there. So if you say, if it was the case if it was the case that the moon was made of cheese, then it is the case that we're doing a podcast. It was the case that the moon was made of cheese, therefore we're doing a podcast, right? The tenses of those propositions doesn't seem to contribute in any way to the validity of the argument. And if I say, if it will be the case that the moon is made of cheese, then we're doing this podcast. It will be the case that the moon is made of cheese, therefore we're doing this podcast. It just seems like the change of tense doesn't make any difference there. If it's valid independently of the tense in the first place, then changing it won't make any difference. And it doesn't seem like the Reaper paradox really cares about tense. I mean, the semantic version of Yablo's doesn't have tense in it at all, right? It just says each of these sentences is true if none of the other ones are, right? There's no tense there. It's a completely timeless scenario. So tense doesn't seem like it should be intrinsic to it. Or, the space versions of it where each Reaper's going to swing his side if and only if none of the ones to the left of him does. There's no tense there because we're talking about space. So tense doesn't seem like it's the thing that's making it valid in one context or whatever. So it shouldn't make a difference if we change tense and chuck in the future version instead. So how does Koons reply to that? So what he does is try and provide a symmetry breaker effectively. So basically what he does is says, look, it's implausible to suppose that the Reapers would be able to satisfy that condition, because how would they know if any of the ones in the future of them are going to swing their sides or not, right? So, like, you can't know the future in the same way that you can know the past. So we've got this kind of epistemological asymmetry, which undergirds the fact that it works one way but not the other. So it requires the agent to know something, and that's the difference when we're talking about tenses. There is an asymmetry there. It's epistemological. And it might be something to do with like entropy or whatnot, who knows, but there's something about the future which means that it's like inaccessible to us in a way that the past isn't. The past leaves traces behind and stuff that we can access in the present. The future hasn't left any traces for us to access now or something. So you might think that sort of asymmetry rebuts the argument. I guess I can pause there. What do you think about that so far as a reply?
Yeah, well, I mean, I did know that that's how he replies to it. I mean, maybe he does consider this in his writing, but like, God knows the future. Like, I don't know. I guess like, what's the difficulty? I mean, maybe they just have this kind of primitive access to the future. They're omniscient and somehow, or like, I don't know. We are under his own view, right? There actually is something that knows the future truths, namely God. And so if actuality entails possibility, and so it's possible to know these things in the future. And yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking. Like, listen, his own view is such that it entails that you can have this knowledge of the future. Now maybe he's going to say like, oh well, no grim messenger could, and I'm just going to be like, what? Why? Like I mean, surely like there's nothing about their constitution which, I don't know, like what are you thinking? That's my response.
Well, that's kind of similar to how it goes, the debate, right? So Cohen basically says, well, God can reveal stuff about the future. I mean, he does reveal stuff in the Bible and whatnot about the future to people. So he could just kind of whisper into each Grim Reaper's ears whether any of the future ones will, and allow them to satisfy the condition. And if he disclosed the future to them in that way, then we've got over the epistemological problem. The thing is, once you've got an agent who's not limited by that epistemological limitation, you can't really appeal to it to help you with the problem. And it seems like a Christian theist in particular, is committed to an agent who both overcomes that epistemological barrier and could tell them about it. So so that's the reply there, is to say like maybe an atheist is stuck there with the asymmetry, but a theist doesn't have a relevant symmetry breaker, because the symmetry breaker itself is kind of overcome by this symmetry, epistemological symmetry, that God actually manifests. He knows the future just as much as the past. In reply, Koons has a kind of confusing reply that says something like, well, God could never make could never really make anything else omniscient. He can be the only omniscient thing. And so that's why he can't tell the other Reapers about that. It's weird. This is
He's not
conveyed.
making them omniscient, though. He's just giving them
Yeah,
knowledge of this one select portion of the future, and like that was already happening in the Bible and things like that, right? That doesn't make them omniscient. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I haven't read enough. Go on.
but that's Koons's reply in the words of Cohen. So it's difficult to know
Okay.
exactly how Koons says it himself because he doesn't actually put it in
Yeah.
his own terms. The whole discussion is relayed by Cohen.
Okay.
So he may have been just implausibly relaying what Koons said to him. On the other hand, if we take it at face value, it does seem rather implausible, right? Because as you said, revealing some aspects of the future doesn't mean revealing everything. So even if he couldn't make another thing omniscient, quite sure I see the argument for that anyway. But let's just say that that was right. That just doesn't seem to be happening here.
I was going to
So
question that mark too. I was thinking like,
yeah,
well, why not? Like,
yeah. So but I thought about it a slightly different way. So I was thinking, well, let's just scrap the Reapers, right? Who cares about that? Let's just suppose. So I was sort of like last year, and we were doing dry January, not drinking any alcohol for the month of January or whatever, and I was reading Grim Reaper stuff at the time. So, and I came up with this version of the argument, which is like, and it's kind of fanciful, but like, suppose and just try and phrase the problem entirely in terms of like God and his own intentions rather than like whispering secrets to Grim Reapers or whatever to try and cut out that unnecessary bit of the dialectic there. Let's just suppose that God is giving up drinking holy water or whatever, right? And what he wants to do is he's gonna check to see whether or not he's going to drink again in the future. He's going to consult his omniscience about the future. And if he sees that today is the last day of him having a drink, he will immediately reward himself with one final drink, right, to say goodbye to having drinking anymore, knowing that the rest of his future is going to be completely drink free. So this will be his last drink. So he's going to drink if and only if he doesn't drink on any subsequent day. Right. And it seems like, well, if God knows the future, he could form an intention like that. Because, I mean, obviously, if you don't like the idea of the like drinking and blah, 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 it doesn't really matter, does it? Because all I'm doing here is saying the instantiates some condition P, if and only if he doesn't do it again in the future. But it was just that I was thinking about the drinking thing at the time. So, now, obviously, if he does form the intention like that and maintains it every day in the future and commit to this, so he's going to keep checking every day, right, to see if he's going to drink again in the future. Well, what's going to happen? He's going to keep drinking every day, right? Because each day he'll see in the future he doesn't have any more drinks and goes, "Yay! Again, I can celebrate for the last time," and he'll keep doing that every day, right? But then that just generates the problem that he foresaw his future being free of drinking. Well, actually, it's full of drinking. So his own omniscience would be contradictory. That his what he'd know about the future would be well wrong. It would have him both drinking and not drinking, which is kind of impossible. So you seem to be able to just generate this, right? And I put this to Bruce in a couple of emails, and we had a little back and forth around it. I'm not sure I can remember his response to do perfect justice to it, but he basically said something like, "Look, God just can't form intentions like that because they're contradictory." So it, which is like, okay, but that's very close to the unsatisfiable
that's the unsatisfiable. Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And it's like, what's to stop me saying what would happen if he did try and form that? Is a mysterious force going to intervene? Like, do you think that's a good objection there? Because if not, why do you think it's a good objection over here? So it feels to me like there's some, I'm not quite sure what the combination of that exchange is supposed to be, but it's interesting. And I don't know. There's certainly more variations of this that need to be explored more in the literature, it seems to me.
Sweet. Well, I think that kind of is going to terminate our discussion, and
okay.
Unfortunately, it's not going to be an endless and infinite discussion of infinitely causal. But yeah, that was really fun, and I really enjoyed that. So hopefully,
cool.
The audience, hopefully you guys found that infinitely fun. I did. I thought that was super exciting, and I'm looking forward to sharing with all you guys the discussion that we had with Graham and that we had with Graham on tautology. So. Yeah, stay tuned for that, everyone. And I guess what better way to end than I'm Joe Schmidt, and this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.